Once More with Feeling by Wetpretzel. Read by LMX Mabella. Chapter 8. Hermione didn't see Draco for the rest of the week, and she wasn't bothered one bit. After that lunch with Harry and Ron the other day, Hermione had decided Draco simply wasn't worth her stress and heartbreak. Her anger. What he had done was despicable, yes, but if she had learned anything from her mother, it was that she wasn't the first, and certainly wouldn't be the last woman to have her personal life be temporarily screwed up by men. And it wasn't like Draco had made that much of an impact on her life anyway, despite what her friends thought. Merlin forbid she needed to rely on Draco to be functional at her job. Her great-aunt Madeline would roll in her grave at the idea of Hermione being dependent on a man. The woman had protested in the suffragette movement, for crying out loud. If her great-aunt could survive chaining herself to a railing for 4 days, Hermione could definitely handle Draco's year-long deception. Harry and Ron aside, how much change could one visit have made to her life? Besides, Draco had lied to her, he had manipulated her life, and he had taken advantage of her trust and promptly crushed it into a million pieces within her. So no, he was not worth Hermione being distracted from her work. Her time and attention needed to be focused on something much more important than him. Like the sneak edgecomb in 5th year, Hermione had no problem turning her back on someone who didn't value and respect trust. She was convinced that this occasion would be exactly the same. Yes, Hermione was confident. She wouldn't miss Draco worth a damn. She missed him like a limp. Hermione hadn't realized just how quiet her flat was when he wasn't around. The disturbing lack of frustrated yells as Draco argued with her cat whenever Crookshanks leapt up onto the kitchen counter when Draco was cooking. The soft whistle of his deep breaths when he was concentrating on his paperwork. When they'd both be sat on her couch, Hermione's feet in his lap, and she'd look up from her book every so often when Draco huffed or chuckled at whatever stupid thing a character had done in his book. The thick silence of her flat now seemed to smother her. Her meals were all bland in her mouth. It didn't matter how many spices Hermione would add to her food. It all tasted like sludge. After the first evening in a row of her throwing her barely eaten dinner into the bin, she had stopped bothering with her efforts and took to just eating a couple slices of toast. If she even had the energy to do that. Her stupid, hard, concrete bed was too empty. Night after night she would coax Crookshanks into her room, and night after night Crookshanks would stalk back out minutes later, and his glare seemingly got even more venomous as each night passed. "I can't believe you're taking his side," Hermione grumbled, when she tried to stop him from escaping the clutches of her arms and he'd clawed at her with a hiss. Crookshanks had just cocked his chin at her, in what she could only assume was a sneer, before he sulked back into the corridor, and she didn't need to follow him to know he had returned to sleep on that blasted green ottoman she hadn't gotten around to throwing away or burning yet. On the nights she managed to get some sleep, broken and restless, she would wake up the next morning to find her nose squashed into Draco's, the spare pillow, on the other side of her bed, her arms wrapped around it desperately. She had had a migraine for the rest of the day when she realized that the scent of his cologne had started to fade from the pillowcase. That evening Hermione sat on the floor of her living room, poring over her notes and research that she hadn't managed to finish in her office. And no, it was not because she didn't have Draco's to-do list to follow. She had simply just taken on more cases, that was all, her neck stiff and her back hunched over horrendously. She found herself scowling at idiotic mistakes made by the archive department in their referencing, and let out a frustrated huff. "Absolutely ridiculous! Draco, come look at this," she said, not looking up from her paperwork. After several seconds of odd silence, Hermione looked up. Her face blanched as she took in her empty living room, and her hand shot up to rub at the sudden, sharp ache in her chest as she remembered. Draco wasn't there. Her breath caught on an inhale as her eyes stung with salty tears. And it was like a tsunami of despair had collided into her, when Hermione found herself realizing that she hadn't noticed just how used to and comfortable she had gotten to Draco being there, until he wasn't. August 2004. There was a knock at her door, Hermione faintly registered through the fog in her mind. She looked up, her head sluggish and heavy with the effort, and her shoulders drooped when she saw Malfoy lean rather dapperly against the doorframe. Please, not today. She was too tired to have to deal with his ponciness. "And just where were you yesterday, Granger?" Malfoy tittered. "If only old McGonagall could see her teacher's pet now. Skiving off work? However will you save your dearest werewolves with that attitude, Granger? His voice was light with mockery, but Hermione could detect the faintest hint of genuine curiosity. She looked back down at the file in her hands, and her vision blackened. A hand shakily reached for her drawer, and she pulled out one of the pepper-up potions her healer had given to her before he had reluctantly discharged her from the ward. "St. Mungo's," was all she replied, once she took a swig of the vial. Through her peripheral vision she noticed Malfoy stand ramrod straight. A small weak flicker of amusement ran through her at the thought that she had caught Malfoy off guard. What? Couldn't you tell that Hermione wasn't in the mood to talk? You asked where I was yesterday. I was at St. Mungo's. Malfoy stalked over to her and she sighed. It looked like she was going to have a conversation anyway. Hermione glanced at her drawer and tried to remember the risks of taking too many pepper-up potions at once. Euphoria, hallucinations, rash decision-making, diarrhea. Probably not the best idea. Malfoy's eyes felt like razors across her skin as he scanned her body. "You don't look injured," he said eventually. His posture going lax, and Hermione could have sworn she saw relief flicker across his face. Maybe hallucinations could occur with just a singular dose too. Hermione straightened the paperwork in the folder. Maybe if she looked busy, he would bugger off, and then Hermione could rest her head against her desk for 5 minutes. Or perhaps 2 minutes. She still had to catch up to yesterday's reading. "That's because I am not injured. It was just a mild case of exhaustion," she said blithely, with a shrug. She looked up, and was taken aback by the scrutinizing glare Malfoy gave her. She huffed and threw him a sneer. "I'm a big girl, Malfoy. It's not the first time it happened. I can handle myself." "Clearly," Malfoy scorned. He clicked his tongue, his eyes narrowed. "Exactly how many times has this happened?" Hermione had decided to stop keeping track after the 4th time Harry had to escort her home. She didn't quite think she was at double digits yet, but Malfoy didn't have to know that. What was it to him anyway? Merlin, she was tired. "Malfoy, can we please not do this now?" she pleaded, softly, and delicately rubbed at her temples as she looked at the piles of sealed cases beside her that had appeared on her desk during her absence. Her chest ached. She had missed 1 day in her office, and yet had somehow managed to be 3 days' worth of work behind her schedule. And Ginny had wondered why Hermione broke things off with Oliver Wood when he had wanted their relationship to become more serious and for her to spend more time with him. She couldn't even afford 1 sick day. And Malfoy stared at her, his face unreadable as he seemingly deliberated something. "Go home, Granger," he said eventually. Hermione frowned. "You're clearly in no shape to be in work right now. You shouldn't be pushing yourself. 1, because you're only going to do a shitty job of your cases, and then you're going to have to start all over again. And 2, you're just going to end up back at St. Mungo's, and that means that I'll have to cover for you, and I really don't want to do that." Malfoy pretended to sigh heavily. "So do me a favor and go home, Granger." She hated that she couldn't argue with his logic. She had already made several mistakes when taking notes on the Grindylow report that morning, and she'd missed a very important meeting to discuss funding for a department that quarter. Hermione opened her mouth to agree when a whoosh sounded out across her office, and a new stack of paperwork fluttered down onto her desk. Her heart positively sunk in her chest, and she looked up at Malfoy, whose jaw was clenched tight at the new papers on her desk, and smiled weakly. "Another time," she said. Malfoy's eyes flickered to hers, and she barely registered the glint of irritation in his expression, before his face cooled and he stared at her blankly. "All right," he said simply, and turned on his heel to stalk out of her office without another word. Hermione waited another 15 minutes to be on the safe side, before I had lulled, and she whimpered as she sunk weakly against the desk. Just 5 minutes, she told herself, before she promptly slept for the rest of the afternoon. The next day Hermione startled as she walked into her office. A grand chestnut oak desk resided next to hers, and a stack of cases that had been delivered to her office the previous day had been brought over, a third of them already opened and organized in front of a calm, indifferent Draco Malfoy. Hermione groaned and fought the urge to slam her head against the desk. She made another mistake in her transcripts and would have to rewrite the last 2 pages, again. Irritated fury bubbled in her chest, and her hand shot out in a violent jerk, promptly knocking the pile of cases next to her on the floor. A minor flash of guilt went through her when Hermione remembered that Medley had spent 45 minutes organizing those files for her. But she was still frustrated, so they would just have to stay there for the time being. Hermione glanced over at Draco's desk, his bouquet as fresh and bright as ever still sat on the edge. She stood and slowly made her way over. A hesitant hand reached out to stroke the delicate flowers. A crumpled-up note stuck to the bottom of the vase, with Hermione's name scrawled on it, caught her eye. She reached for it curiously. Hull Muggle Central sighting. Update needed. Archives return 1 o'clock. Buy Granger's Vile Biscuits. Hermione shuddered on an exhale as her eyes fluttered in disbelief. Had Draco really made a note to make sure she didn't run out of biscuits? Her eyes squeezed shut, her chest suddenly warm, yet cold at the same time. How many times had he done this? How many times had Draco gone out of his way to do something for Hermione that she hadn't even needed? He hated her biscuit habit, yet he went out of his way to make sure she didn't go without them. Hermione thought of all the times her biscuit drawer had somehow been fully stocked overnight, despite her being positive she hadn't had the time to visit her supermarket. Only on some occasions had Hermione acknowledged that, logically, Draco must have refilled them for her. Merlin, had he gone into the Muggle world for her? Hermione's eyes stung with bitter tears. Just one more thing she hadn't paid much attention to. She couldn't even remember if she'd ever thanked him. No, it was just one more thing she had adapted to. Like his desk, like his to-do list, like his lunchboxes. It was one more thing that had just eased into her routine. Effortless. Harry's voice echoed in her mind. Hermione swallowed thickly, the note crinkling as she pressed it against her chest shakily. A knock on her door drew her out of her musings. She turned to acknowledge her assistant and tried to not flush when Medley paused with a curious look at the files that had been tossed to the floor. Medley couldn't quite hide her questioning glance, but wisely chose not to mention it. Medley couldn't quite hide her questioning glance, but wisely chose not to mention it as she handed Hermione a file. The little gossip would probably tell half of their floor by lunchtime, though. "Thank you, Laura," she said, and walked back to her desk in a way that she hoped looked like indifference. To her surprise, Medley lingered, her teeth gnawing at a bit of dry skin on her lip as she glanced between Hermione's and Draco's desk. Hermione raised a brow at her. "Yes?" Medley paused for a moment, her eyes wide and cautious. "May I speak candidly?" Hermione blinked. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. "You may." "Are you mad at Mr. Malfoy for something? It's just that he hasn't been here for over a week now. And well, both of you, I'm not being funny or anything, Miss Granger, but neither of you are looking too good." Hermione's pulse quickened. "You've seen Mr. Malfoy?" Medley's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, well, just around. He's not really been in his office that much." She shuffled, and Hermione couldn't help but wonder if her assistant was regretting speaking up. "But anyway, I just wanted to say, whatever it is, my gran always taught me that there's nothing that can be solved by just talking things out." Yes, well, Medley's grandmother probably hadn't been deceived into a relationship for over a year. Hermione just smiled politely at her, and her assistant took that as a cue to leave. The sticky note in her peripheral vision had a question pop up in her mind, and Hermione called after her. "Laura!" Hermione bit the inside of her cheek. "The other day you said that Draco and I were good together. What did you mean by that?" Medley smiled. Hermione would almost say she swooned as she shrugged. "I don't know. I can't really explain it. You just fit together, you know? Like puzzle pieces or something. Like it's almost like you don't even need to try. It's just effortless," Hermione finished for her with a mad laugh of disbelief. Medley nodded and beamed at her. "Yeah, exactly." Hermione glanced over her assistant's shoulder and peered into the corridor. The rest of the department, do they know as well? Did they all laugh about it, about her during their lunch break? Did they also have a betting pool? Did they think Hermione was cheap for sleeping with a colleague? Did they all secretly think she was incapable of doing her job? "Not everyone," Medley interrupted her misery. "Like I said, I know we're trying to keep things quiet, and a couple of us knew, but it's like proper romantic, you know? We call you the Dream Team. Ever since we started working together, our turnover rates have skyrocketed. Do you know that we all got Christmas bonuses for the first time last year? That was because of you two." Medley smiled at her again, but her eyes were wide with pity. "Again, I don't want to be overstepping boundaries or anything, miss, but for what it's worth, I mean, We all know your history with each other, so I don't think that there's anything the two of you couldn't overcome." Hermione didn't say another word as Medley left her office, her assistant's last words circling on repeat in her mind as she reached for Draco's note again. Her fingers traced over the elegant swoop of his handwriting. She had always admired his handwriting, and she couldn't ignore the small voice in her mind that questioned if she had been overreacting. Hermione wrote Draco a letter that evening, asking him to come over, her poor eagle-feathered quill a half-toot in her anxiety. She stood at her kitchen window and stared at the letter in her hand as she tried to summon the strength to attach it to the waiting owl's leg. Had she been overreacting? Was Hermione blowing this whole thing out of proportion? Yes, he had lied to her, but he did have a point. She had enjoyed their outings together, and admittedly, yes, she had been the one to make the first physical move more often than not in the beginning. Had Draco somehow misinterpreted that as some kind of subtle signal that she wanted more? She had been the one to beg him to stay when Crookshanks was ill. She did have him as emergency contact. Merlin, she'd even confessed that she needed him with her. Was that all just a big circus of miscommunication? But then again, a dark voice in her mind spoke up. He had to have known what he was doing was wrong on some level. Why else had he never made an attempt to talk to her? Why had he spent so much time and effort, meticulously planning everything, artfully choosing his words so that she couldn't interpret his invitations as a date? Why would he go through all of that if he didn't acknowledge on some level that he knew what he was doing was morally incomprehensible? Hermione couldn't help but think about how ludicrous this all was. Would he have truly waited for her? Was Draco really content to just live off of the scraps of affection Hermione could afford to give until she retired? Or more likely, would he decide he was tired of waiting for her and go on to marry that beautiful, faceless, pure-blood heiress and live a happy life void of Hermione and her stubbornness, her poor eating habits, her concrete mattress, her demonic cat, her dedication to her job that, sure, other people might have thought bordered on unhealthy? Medley's words echoed in her mind. They all thought that she and Draco made a good team. Was this really something that the pair of them could just talk out? Could Hermione forgive him that easily for his deception, for his humiliation of her? Okay, so Medley claimed that their department didn't judge Hermione. But was that really something they would all just say out loud? Hermione was a boss after all. Who's to say that Medley hadn't withheld some other truth? Hermione remembered how judgmental Medley was during the Daphne and William debacle. What if Hermione and Draco did go on to have a genuine relationship and they broke up? Could Hermione really spend every lunch break in the cafeteria, putting up with people's knowing and gossipy stares? The pitied looks from her department every time she and Draco walked past one another? And when they would need to work together on a case with Draco as a liaison? To have to stand so close to him, breathe in that wonderful, intoxicating cologne of his? To not even playfully tug on her hair when her back rounded too far forward? Could Hermione even trust Draco anymore? Any future decision she would ever make, would she wonder if it was truly her own choice? Would she second-guess any career accomplishment? Wonder how much of it came from her own work or from Draco's interference? And yet, did a part of her want to find out? Some small, insatiable, curious side of her that wanted to forgive him, that wanted to give in to her desires and fantasies of being with him, to summon that Gryffindor courage of hers and throw all caution to the wind. Did she owe it to herself and to him to try? Eventually, the owl grew tired of waiting for her to make her decision and nipped at her fingers in spite before taking off into the night to fly back to the postal office owlery. It was probably for the best, she thought, after she wordlessly cast an incendio on the envelope and watched as the shaky slope of his name melted into ash. He hadn't tried to contact her either. Hermione tried not to think about why that hurt so much. Her foot paused mid-step into her office, the hackles on the back of her neck tense with trepidation. Something was off, wrong. Had she left the window open overnight? A glance over to the glass told her that wasn't the case. Bugger. She had forgotten to send off the transcript of her interview with the Gringotts banker, hadn't she? Hermione dashed to her desk before she stopped. The vividly distinct memory of her handing the envelope over to Medley flashed in her mind. She frowned, irritation licking at her spine as she slowly sunk into her desk chair. Hermione huffed after counting the cases on the desk. There was nothing new, there was nothing missing. Her mind screeched to a halt, and Hermione exhaled shakily. The painful, crushing realization that a certain desk next to her was void of any color. Draco's hydrangeas were gone, and it was as if the walls were closing in on her from within. A sharp, pained gasp slipped from her mouth, and the nails dug into the armrest as her chest rattled and throbbed in anguish. She whimpered and her eyes stung. Her head was too heavy, her lungs were too tight. Her office was too small, and there wasn't enough air. She couldn't breathe. Draco's hydrangeas were gone. She couldn't breathe. She had to get out of here. She shakily rose from her chair and barely remembered to pick up her bag again as she headed for the doorway. Hermione had just enough wits about her to inform her assistant that she was feeling under the weather and that she was taking a sick day. Had the corridor always been this long? Why hadn't the lift arrived yet? She practically gasped in relief when the lift doors opened, and only when she was safe in its enclosure, and it catapulted backwards away from her office, away from his desk, did Hermione allow the cloud of sorrow to overtake her, collapsing against the wall of the lift as she let out a shuddered sob. What surely had to be one of the lowest moments in Hermione's life was when she found herself stood in the frozen food aisle of a Muggle supermarket and crying in front of the pins of mint chocolate chip ice cream. Hermione blubbered and quickly brought her hand up to cover her mouth to suppress the guttural whimper that burned at the back of her throat. There was a younger girl stood only a couple of feet away from her. Hermione could only guess she was around 20 or so, rather drearily dressed in grey jogging bottoms and a frayed, oversized men's jersey, her hair a greasy, unkempt bun at the top of her head. She looked as miserable as Hermione felt. Hermione watched as the girl reached for a pint of cookie dough ice cream and sent Hermione a pitied, limp smile, like some silent form of camaraderie, as she turned to walk to the checkout till. The small, silent act of kindness sent a fresh wave of tears down Hermione's cheek, and she stood there for another 20 minutes, snivelling and whimpering over gross mint chocolate ice cream. She would have to find a new supermarket to patron, she thought as she ignored the questioning glances that Muggles would give her as they walked by the aisle. Hermione startled as a gravelled yet jovial voice sounded out from behind her. "I know these inflation rates are devastating, aren't they?" An old man shook his head in dismay at the price stickers. £4 for some ice cream! Why, when I was your age, they were only a sixpence. It had been 2 weeks since Hermione last saw Draco, and she had been in a foul mood for the last 3 days. Of course, neither of those things were related. It just seemed as if her entire department had decided to be as incompetent as possible, and Hermione rarely managed to make it a couple of hours without snapping at another inept co-worker, who couldn't tell the difference between the inductive and deductive methods of organizing presidential cases, or who stupidly couldn't name the leader of the 18th century Goblin Rebellion. Urg the Unclean was on a chocolate for a card for Merlin's sake. Honestly, she thought the ministry had standards when it came to employment. She had even snapped at her department head when Hermione had been told that the Spirit Division was to take 4% of their budget that quarter. She had promptly set the memo informing her of a disciplinary meeting on fire when it arrived at her desk that morning. It wasn't just her department that was taking the force of her wrath. Harry had asked her rather innocuously if she wanted to come over Friday evening to help set up the nursery before Ginny's due date arrived. An acidic rage exploded from her as she sneered that, no, she did not want to help set up baby Albus Severus' room, and that, quite frankly, it was borderline child abuse for Harry to want to give his son that name. Hermione sat back in her chair and angrily stabbed at her overcooked carrots, whilst Harry just gawped at her. Her spine was tight with vexation, her mind stewed with her thoughts. Didn't Harry know by now that her Friday evening belonged to Hermione had burned the thought in her mind before it could finish. At least she had finally stopped crying. Her humiliating display at the supermarket had promptly drained her of any more anguish, and instead, her initial fury from that night had reclaimed her. She told herself that she must have just needed a few days to let it all out. Some lingering repressed emotions from that night that she hadn't had time to process fully. Her and Draco had obviously just spent too much time together, and she had let herself grow too dependent on his presence. Hermione just needed time to reset her routine, to go back to the days before his stupid oak desk had stolen all that lovely space in her office. Now that he had put some distance between them, it was clear Hermione had just grown spoiled and sloppy with her work when he was around. She had gotten unknowingly used to him snatching cases from her hands, his stupid to-do list, his comforting hand massaging her neck when it was stiff and achy at the end of the day, the tuck on her plate that reminded her to straighten her back once in a while. It was obvious in hindsight that Draco had been far too distracting for her. Without him there to drag her to the flue once the sun had set, and he had decided that she had done enough work for the day, an absolute preposterous notion, Hermione was free to stay as late as she wanted in her office. It had taken Hermione pulling 3 all-nighters in a row, but she had finally caught up to her April files, and she felt the most wonderfully exhaustingly productive she had in months. It wasn't like she could sleep anyway, thanks to her stupid, empty, and uncomfortable bed. So yes, Hermione was doing much better. It turned out that a little bit of space was all that she had needed. She didn't even miss Draco that much anymore anyway. It wasn't even the sex that Hermione missed. As glorious, soul-scorching, and wonderful as it was, she thought as she lied in bed, curled up like a woodlouse. She tried voraciously to ignore the chill against her exposed back. It was the way she squeezed her arm tight against her stomach at night, trying in vain to imitate a strong and secure possessive grip. It was her imagining his soft, sleepy good mornings and good nights, the ghost of a kiss at the nape of her neck. It was the way she would stand up to walk out of her office to hand Medley a file, and her vision would blacken, her legs shaken and weak, and Hermione would realize that it was almost 4 in the afternoon, and she hadn't eaten anything more than a couple of biscuits. And she realized with a punch to the gut it was because she had been waiting for Draco to walk in and hand her a lunchbox. Of a night, whilst Hermione desperately tried to ignore the emptiness of the other side of their bed, she could hear Crookshanks cry and whine as he scratched at the fireplace gate, her poor familiar confused and hurt as to why his playmate had seemingly abandoned him. It was washing her face at night, noticing all of the ink stains on her face, and her chest would burn. She imagined Draco's amused grin and his hearty laughs as she whacked a pillow against his face and complained that he had let her spend all evening with her face an inked mess. When Hermione would head to a flue in the morning, and her body seized with panic when she realized that she had forgotten to set the night wards, again, because she had gotten used to Draco being the one to do it every night. It was the determination and unhealthy grind of his teeth when Draco tried a more complex recipe of a Friday evening, and the way his chest would expand pridefully when it was cooked properly. Hermione's heart would flutter at the beautiful way his eyes lit up when she told him that the food was truly delicious. The way she looked forward to him bringing her lunches most days, not just because of how mouth-watering it could be, but because it meant that she got to see that soft, private grin of his. It was how Draco actually listened and actively engaged in discussions with her over whichever academic theory had sprouted in her mind of an evening. How he didn't back down if he disagreed with her, and on some occasions would even briefly pop to visit his family's library and come back with texts just to prove how wrong she was. How he would gently kiss her lips once, twice, and then a third time until her sulky pout melted away and she pulled his body on top of hers. He would smirk afterwards as she trembled and panted against his chest, and ask her if that was her way of admitting she was wrong. When they would visit museums or exhibitions, and his eyes wouldn't glaze over in boredom, like her friends would. Instead, they would be sharp, focused, and inquisitive, as he hounded their poor tour guide with as many questions as Hermione would. The way that, despite all of his quips and jokes about the deadly beasts, Draco poured his soul into his work, because if there was anyone as stubborn as herself, it was him, and he refused to accept failure. It was the satisfied oozing of his eyes when he completed one of his brilliantly planned to-do lists, and would promptly march over to her desk, planting devious kisses along her neck as he coaxed her into leaving the office for the day. The beautiful coloring of his cheeks as he shyly accepted the bouquet of flowers Hermione got for him, flowers that, despite his mocking tone, he genuinely kept on his desk, reinforcing the stasis charm every couple of days. Heck, it was even the crude and nearly always uncalled-for comments about her wardrobe choices. The way his nose would scrunch and light the stain whenever she mixed fabrics. "Satin does not go with corduroy, bloody hell, Granger!" And he would glare in contemplation at her potato sack dress, like he was debating the consequences of setting the blasted thing on fire. It was as encouraging smiles with a warm hand rubbing at her back when Hermione was mentally roadblocked in a case. His sexy smirk when he caught her staring at him when she really should have been focusing on her work. His hand rubbing circles on her ankles as they rested in his lap. How, despite his teasing of her own ink freckles, he had quite the hefty monthly bill from Twiddle's dry cleaners, because he would come home after work with what looked like half of his ink pot stained against the left sleeve of his shirt, too focused on completing his paperwork that he would often forget to wait to let the ink dry. Her mind was plagued with all of these moments, seemingly nondescript, yet precious in each of their own ways. Hermione sniffled on a watery sob, and snuggled deeper into her cold sheets that had been freed of Draco's scent for several long, excruciating days now. A painful, hollow ache in her chest as her mind focused only on the fact that she just missed him. A week later, Hermione was in the middle of rereading the same paragraph about a goblin who had successfully sued his banker employees in New Zealand for the fourth time when Draco walked through her door. His gaze down and his feet seemed to drag against the floor. Her pen dropped to the floor, her chest tight with panic and trepidation, and the sound made his head snap up. His eyes widened briefly before his face went neutral, a cool emptiness to his expression that Hermione decided she hated. Draco paused to clear his throat. I thought you had a meeting. He glanced over his shoulder, and Hermione watched as he squinted suspiciously toward her assistant's desk. He was holding a lunch bag, she realized belatedly, and a betraying shiver of happiness danced up her spine. Draco followed her gaze and quickly snapped his hand behind his back. It was unfair how charmingly endearing he looked with his ears flushed hotly. I cancelled it. I wasn't feeling well. Draco's jaw twitched. Have you been eating? You know I haven't. Hermione's eyes flickered to a biscuit drawer, and she felt a sick, twisted sense of rebellious satisfaction at the way his forehead vein pulsed angrily when he tracked the movement. He looked up at her ceiling in resignation and squeezed his eyes shut, a silent, for fuck's sake, mouth on his lips before he huffed, storming over to angrily slam the lunch bag on her desk. Parents are densists. Revolting little thing. Oh, but I have too much sugar in my tea, Draco grumbled. Hermione was certain that if her heart wasn't currently being hammered against her ribcage, she'd have bitten back a fond smile at his fumbled phrasing of her parent's profession. Draco thumped into the seat opposite her desk, which, no, that was wrong, all wrong. He didn't belong there. He belonged at the grand desk by her side. Draco quirked a brow at her when she just stared at him. Eat. Hermione's stomach curled with sour irritation at his blunt order. Merlin, she forgot how insufferable he could be sometimes. What? Do I have to explain the process to you? He rolled his eyes. Eat. Oh, so they were back to him making decisions for her, were they? Hermione's face crunched up into a sneer, her mouth positively saked with venom. Telling you what to do now? What, do you think you're my boyfriend or something? The words fell out of her mouth before she could stop them, and she winced internally at the hot, defiant flush of regret that sneered in her chest. Draco also couldn't hold back his wince, his face briefly pinched with hurt, and the minute's flare of bitterness. Hermione looked down at the desk, ashamed. I'm sorry, she whispered. That was uncalled for. She thumped at her desk, not wanting to look up and let him see the way her cheeks burned in mortification at her spiteful retort. Draco was quiet for a few moments, the air between them thick and suffocating. You know, a sort of clever witch once told me I was no good to anyone, dropping down dead. Hermione blinked. The hazy memory of a damned library corner and an exhausted boy drifted through her mind. I believe that was due to sleep deprivation. Humans can survive much longer without food. She couldn't help but bait him. It was easier trying to make him angry, easier to focus on her spiteful bitterness than the way her heart was rapid against her chest. That little devilish voice in the back of her mind that pleaded for her to slide herself in his lap, to pull herself across his delicious thighs. His thighs that resided in that too-wrong chair. Draco's eyes twitched and his tongue flicked against the inside of his cheeks in annoyance, but he didn't respond, his challenging glare fixed on hers. A loud grumble from her stomach broke the tense silence between them, and Hermione's cheeks pricked hotly with embarrassment. She bit back a curse and shot him a filthy glare as he snickered at her. She petulantly reached for the bag and slumped against the backrest of her chair as she pulled out the Tupperware box and slapped it against her desk. Hermione avoided eye contact as she dug in, and fought her eyes from rolling back into her skull as the overwhelming, much-needed, savory flavors danced across her taste buds. As delicious as the casserole was, the beef so tender it all but melted in her mouth, the overachieving bastard, it paled in comparison to the small smile that ghosted his lips. It was brief, barely a blink, but it was there, and it was beautiful. And he was still sitting in a bloody chair. Hermione gripped the fork tighter in an attempt to suppress the way her hand trembled. The stale silence eventually began to gnaw at her, and the food began to taste like ash, her senses unable to focus on anything other than him. You used too much salt. He hadn't. It was cooked to perfection. And Draco clearly knew it too, as he cocked his eyebrow and threw her a mild glare, the expression softened by the faintest hint of fond exacerbation in his eyes. "I've been distracted," he said, with a pointed look. Hermione flushed at the implication of his words. Her tongue wet her lips nervously, and she looked back down at her desk. The back of her fork had practically obliterated her last few potatoes by the time she thought of something else to say. "Mr. Will, you know, the goblin who filed a claim for wrongful inheritance against Gringotts. He told me about a case in New Zealand, some sort of distant cousin of his, and there's some really fascinating legislation that I might be able to find similarities to in our archives." She forked out an extra long slice of onion and placed it aside on the Tupperware lid. "Did you know that New Zealand Parliament gave permission for blood inheritance magic to be submitted during the trial?" Draco picked at a piece of invisible dirt from his nails and flicked his brows in slight indifference. "You thinking of comparing to the Centaur Belt Act, then?" he drawled. Hermione nodded, a small bloom of relief in her chest at the normalcy of it all. Maybe Draco had decided things needed to go back to how they were before. Maybe Draco had realized how absurd it would be for them to be together. They had spent a lot of time together, after all. He must have just misunderstood his feelings to mean something more than they actually were, and he had just gotten caught up in the rushed thrill of sneaking behind her back. There was surely no way Draco actually wanted to date her. She felt like her soul had been poisoned at the thought. "Yes, she cleared her throat, a little hoarse and scratchy. I was thinking if modern-day centaur packs could reclaim that sacred grounds their ancestors walked on, then surely goblins should be able to do the same for—" "Granger, are we really not going to talk about this?" Draco cut her off. His eyes flashed hot. Hermione's spine felt wet with cold sweat, and the temperature of the room seemed to have suddenly dropped. Her mouth parted as she faltered, only for a moment, before her chest flared defensively and she narrowed her eyes. "Talk about what? You sneaking behind my back and lying to me for a year." "Back to that, are we?" Draco huffed. "Oh, you denying it?" "You do know you would have actually had to have been willing to sit down and talk about us and our relationship." Hermione's heart skipped a beat at the term. "Before you decided to stick your bushy, stubborn head in the ground. I'd hardly call it lying to you if you didn't even want to hear the truth to begin with." "An admission of the truth is still a lie," Hermione gritted out. "And don't think I've forgotten that you've made my friends and colleagues lie to me as well." "So is that what it's about, then?" Draco raised a brow, his expression daring to look bored. "You're being pissy because your old acquaintances knew something that you didn't. Is this all because your pride is a little wounded?" "No, I'm being pissy because you've been manipulating me in my choices," she spat. Draco rolled his eyes. "Merlin, Granger, is it really so offensive to you that I want you to be my girlfriend?" Hermione inhaled sharply, and her rage shuddered to a screaming halt. Her heart thumped painfully against her chest as Draco met her widened eyes with his own piercing, hungry gaze. Draco leaned in slowly, like a python about to strike its prey, and every cell in Hermione's body practically hummed in anticipation. "Is it really so terrible that I want to call you mine?" Draco's voice was like silk, and Hermione swallowed shakily to force down a whimper. Her eyes dropped to his lips. Merlin. She had forgotten how soft they looked, and her navel quivered when he hummed. She looked back up at him. The heat in his eyes left her throat parched. "Is it terrible that I want to treat you to dinner at nice restaurants, and arrange private museum tours and exhibitions for you to soak up to your swotty little heart's content?" "Draco," Hermione breathed. "Do you know that you're the most beautiful when you're all geeked out on academia? The way your eyes go hazy when you're absorbing every word of a textbook, when that cute little lip of yours gets gnawed to death by your teeth because you're trying to hold back from torturing that poor little tour guide with another question we both know that he doesn't know the answer to." Draco's eyes were drooped and heavy as he explored her face, his expression awed and open with wonder. "Can you really blame me for wanting to be there to witness it? I was always raised to appreciate the finer things in life after all," he murmured. "Smooth bastard. You really want to date me that badly?" She could not back the disbelief in her voice as she stared at him in scrutiny. Draco huffed as he leaned back against the chair. He flicked the label of his tie disinterestedly, his casual, laid-back posture ruined by the pained tightness of his eyes. Well, given that I'm desperately in love with you, yes, it'd be nice to grab coffee sometimes, he drawled. Hermione's heart stopped beating. The tightness of his face seemingly melted away, and he gazed at her. Hermione had never seen him look so open and unguarded before. He loved her. Draco rose from his chair slowly, his eyes never leaving hers as he inched his way around the desk. His fingers danced lightly across the edge, and Hermione shivered, like they were exploring her skin instead. He loved her. He was in front of her now, and he crouched to be level with her. A hand reached out, and his fingers glided through her curls. The nape of her neck tingled when his fingertips kissed the skin there. He loved her. Draco cupped her face gently with his thumbs, resting at the edge of her lips. She exhaled shakily, unable to tear her gaze away from the intensity of his eyes. He loved her. I love you, Hermione, Draco murmured. A thumb brushed against her lip, and his eyes darkened hotly when her tongue traced its path. He looked back up at her, his eyes fierce with determination, but light in their honesty. I love you, and all I want to do is make you happy. I know I can make you so fucking happy, Hermione. His forehead rested against hers, and one of her hands shot up and gripped at his hand on her cheek in a vain attempt to ground herself in a rapid heartbeat. Hermione couldn't hold back a whimper. Every fibre of her body was on fire. The very essence of her magic sung through her veins. I should have been honest with you from the start. I should have told you how I felt. I mean it, Granger. I'd wait forever for you. I should have told you I can wait, but fuck, I'm a selfish man, Granger. Once I'd had a taste of you in my arms, I knew I had to have you again. He swallowed, and his eyes clenched shut. His hands trembled against her cheeks, and she couldn't stop herself from squeezing his hands in hers. I love you so fucking much, Hermione. Please, please, baby, let me prove how good we are together. We're so good together, Hermione. Draco's eyes shut open, and he pulled away, and her body whined and ached in protest. He rested back on his heels, and Hermione had to look down. It was like his eyes had a hold on her. She felt as if she looked away, she would suffocate. Being held by Draco, it was like the first time she had been able to breathe easy in weeks. I'm going to ask you one more time, Hermione, Draco said slowly, and I promise I'll accept your answer, no matter what. He swallowed thickly, the hand on her knee squeezed painfully. Can you see yourself being with me? Will you give us a chance? Hermione stared at him with her mouth slightly agape, her thoughts whipping through her mind, too quickly for her to focus on clearly. The deafening pounding of her heartbeat made her ears hurt, and her skin practically vibrated under his steady and awaiting gaze. Her head throbbed, and her senses were overwhelmed with too many memories: his cologne, his slicked skin, his private smile, his possessive arm around her waist, the twinkling melody of the restaurant band and Grease, Ginny telling her how crazy he was for her, a promise to use magic the next time they decorated her flat at Christmas, his cheek nuzzling her hand under the gloomy lights of the hospital ward, her assistant believing they made a good team, the hole in her chest when she thought about him being with any other witch, how the only way she could fall asleep was if she was holding something that smelled like him now, how she had missed him, and Hermione just stared at him, her voice trapped in her throat like a cage. Draco blinked, a shaken, heavy exhale as his shoulders slumped, his face grey with resignation, and he cast his gaze towards the door. Finally got my answer, then, he said, with a bitter laugh, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were closed off, empty, soulless. She hated it. Understood, Granger. He stood up and left her office without a backwards glance. Hermione's eyes saw and dry as she stared at the empty doorway for minutes afterwards. He'd left. She hadn't found her words yet. He'd left. Her mouth hadn't worked. He'd left. She wanted to tell him. He'd left. Her chest trembled, and it was like sorrow and despair ripped through her muscles. Her lungs contracted tight, and her hand shook as she tried to press against her throat. Why couldn't she breathe? A ragged razor gasp tore from her throat, and her knees collided painfully with the floor when she slipped from her chair. One hand clawed at the floor desperately, her vision blurry and stinging with sultry tears, as her other hand scratched at her chest. Her insides were positively eviscerated, and a broken, blubbered sob finally freed itself from her mouth. Can you see yourself being with me? And it was minutes too late, but her mouth finally found the words that had been screaming at her from within her mind since the moment he'd asked her. No, from the moment he had sent her that first dinner invitation over a year ago. Yes! Yes, I could, she sobbed to her empty office. And in that moment, Hermione knew. She knew that all of her anguish and all of her heartache these last few weeks wasn't just because she missed him. She knew that her anger hadn't just been directed at him or her friends or her colleagues. She was angry at herself. Because with every denial, every frustration for even daring to daydream about them being something more than co-workers, every time she threw herself into another case, every time she hid behind the mountains of paperwork and legislation, she had been afraid. Afraid of how he made her feel, afraid of how simple he made things for her, afraid of just how miserable she was without him around, afraid to admit that her excuses about being too busy were just that, excuses. It had been so much easier to say she was busy that she couldn't justify her own selfish desires against the dire life or death needs of her creatures. It had been so much easier for her to disregard Draco's invitations as just fleeting fancy, never once allowing herself even a second of her time to consider if his feeling for her were genuine. He was Draco Malfoy, and she was Hermione Granger. Of course he would have never actually wanted her, and she would have convinced herself of that. It had been so much easier for Hermione to be angry at her own feelings, convinced that he would never want her as much as she wanted him, to use that anger and redirect it to her cases, to stick her head in the sand, like he had said, so that she wouldn't have to face the fact that she needed him. So gut-wrenchingly stubborn in her own denial, she blinded herself from the truth that had screamed at her. Draco was good for her. And she hadn't been able to accept that. She hadn't been able to forgive herself for needing him. She hadn't been able to accept just how much she fell apart without him there to pull her back together. She hadn't wanted to need him. And so she'd smothered every morsel of affection, every flutter in her stomach, every daydream and fantasy she'd clawed into smithereens, convinced herself that those feelings would soon pass, that one day she would truly be able to look at him and feel nothing but professional respect for him, that one day she wouldn't want him anymore. Oh, but how she did. How she wanted him so much. It was like she couldn't breathe until he was near her. And that knowledge had always been there, lurking in the back of her mind. She knew with every to-do list she eagerly reached for. She knew with every lunchbox she gorged herself on. She knew with every sneaking glance she gave him, his wry, knowing grin fueling her to finish that particular section of her paperwork. She knew with every argument he had with her cat. She knew even before he'd given her all of that space to think for 3 weeks. Yes, she knew. She'd always known. And it was like a fresh wave of anguish drowned her, and she let out another wild sob. "Miss Granger! Is everything Miss Granger? Miss Granger!" Alarmed footsteps rushed over to her, and the scent of fruity, summery perfume enveloped her, as Madley's arms cautiously wrapped around her shoulders. "Miss Granger! What should I call Mr. our Potter?" Hermione shook her head and turned to bury her head into her assistant's shoulder as she sobbed, the undeniable, all-consuming truth throbbing in her chest. Hermione hadn't needed these past 3 weeks to know that she loved him too. Thank you for listening to today's chapter of Once More with Feelin by Wetpretzel, read by Alex Mabella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on AO3, YouTube, or Tumblr. Thank you to Wetpretzel for letting me read their story, and thank you to all of you for listening.